3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
There is no other institution that has the ability uniquely
Without a heritage, every generation starts over.
to remind the current regime
What your country.
We, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do.
to get back in their box and stay there.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
From the Heritage Foundation, this is Heritage Explains.
Arctic frost is Joe Biden's Watergate.
That is Senator Ted Cruz speaking at a press conference convened by Republican U.S. senators last week. Each of them had been targeted by an FBI-led investigation known as Arctic frost, undertaken by the Biden Department of Justice in 2022. Senator Cruz continues.
Merrick Garland was a fundamentally corrupt attorney general. Jack Smith was a fundamentally corrupt prosecutor. This was a political enemies list from the beginning. 197 subpoenas for 430 Republican entities and individuals. That is an absolute and egregious abuse of power.
Here's Senator Eric Schmidt.
I can't think of a bigger political scandal in the last 100 years. So if you want to compare it to Watergate, this is 100 times worse than Watergate, and here's why. To sort of amplify the point that Senator Graham was making, 3 days after President Trump announced he was running for president, this system was weaponized against him. Jack Smith, who is notorious in prosecutor world as being a Stalin-like show me the man, I'll show you the crime prosecutor. That's the guy you appoint when you want to get your political opponent. He's a dirtbag. A dirtbag.
And Senator Chuck Grassley.
Arctic frost was the vehicle by which FBI agents and DOJ prosecutors could improperly investigate the entire Republican political apparatus. Contrary to what Smith has said publicly, this was clearly a fishing expedition.
Here to explain what happened in Arctic frost and what to expect in the coming weeks and months is Mike Howell, the president of the Oversight Project and a good friend of the Heritage Foundation. Mike Howell, welcome back to Heritage Explains.
Hey, thanks for having me on, buddy.
So you're joining us from the Oversight Project. You guys get up to some pretty interesting stuff over there. Tell us about Oversight. What do you do? What makes your organization different?
Yeah, so obviously Oversight Project was incubated at the Heritage Foundation for a couple years. What makes us different is we're a team of really grizzled and seasoned investigators from all walks of professional life out of some of, the institutions like the FBI and intelligence community combined with a very zealous law firm that goes out and tries to combine investigations and litigation into information for the secret recipe for the cake of accountability. And so we're meant to solve for the lack of that in our public life. That is our mission, and that's what we aim to do.
You guys have been following very, very closely this Arctic frost story. You have said that it's one of the biggest scandals in our government's recent history. For those who maybe are behind, maybe just hearing about it, catching up, what is Arctic frost?
So I know it gets really confusing, right? There's so many years of lawfare and operation names and players and people and targets and myths and all of that nonsense. So I always like to start by explaining it. It's best to understand it on a long continuum, a continuum that involved the weaponization for partisan political purposes of federal law enforcement and intelligence functions in concert with the Democrat Party, mainstream media, and the like. And at some points, yes, even foreign governments. And so this chapter in the continuum is called Arctic frost. It relates to after the 2020 election, such that it was an election. We can quibble about that, but we'll reserve that topic for another show. The highest levels of the DOJ and FBI signed off on an operation called Arctic Frost, which is to borrow the name of a type of orange. So it was in its DNA a mockery of President Trump. And the point of it was to put a dragnet around all those who, raised claims about the validity of the election and participated in any lawful efforts to, ensure for election integrity or challenging results. Something that's an old practice in the United States, by the way. And so without any predication, and that's a critically important part because they launched this without predication, they basically put a dragnet around not just politicians and elected officials and the president, but also a lot of conservative personalities and organizations that were involved or vocal in those efforts. And so it's a gigantic mapping exercise. And you'll hear some of the talking heads that hopefully, you shouldn't be listening to say, well, you know what? It was lawfully done. Well, that's not really true. It was an abuse of power for sure. And they'll say, well, there was lawful predication. There wasn't. But the point I want you to fixate on is none of this resulted in any criminal convictions. Can you imagine something that is a size and scale, which is unprecedented, resulting in none? There was nothing to go after in the first place.
So I want to zero in on this concept of predication and why that's so important. What does that mean to the layman?
Well, if you're at the FBI, you can't just be like, I don't like that guy. I'm going to, turn the tools that we have for basically domestic surveillance and investigation on this person. You have to have something that's an allegation of a crime to open that up. It's a civil liberties issue, civil rights issue. And so they basically had false predication for a lot of these things. They had nothing to go off. There was no underlying crime. As proven that nobody ended up going to jail over it. And so you have to have a reasonable suspicion of a crime occurring, which they did not have. And they, from the highest levels of DOJ, they knew that. They knew that all the way through. But they didn't want to resist the opportunity that January 6th in their mind had given them to not, have in their mind the political and moral justification to destroy their enemies.
As you mentioned, this was a huge investigation by the Biden DOJ into hundreds of conservatives. Can you give us a sense of what this looked like? What were they actually doing? Who was targeted? What were they looking for? What methods did they use?
Yeah, so an avalanche of legal process. I mean, the FBI basically dug up, I think, some over 100 million lines of toll data, which are cell phone records on politicians. It's some of the sensitive information. And people who will say, well, it's not the underlying content of their communications, it's just the ping from one device to another. Well, it's still pretty dang bad. I mean, I, as an investigator myself, if you gave me the cell phone records of all of our opponents on the left, I would have quite a field day. You can understand the magnitude of information you can glean by mapping. Then there was an avalanche of subpoenas on bank records and the like, and they were just fishing. It was fishing for as much information in that moment of fury where they had an institutionally aligned FBI and the partisan nature of this. This took a lot of people at the FBI to pull it off.
Many of the people who were targeted by this operation were high-profile elected officials. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's some 8 senators, tons of, obviously conservative leaders, but there were a fair amount of politicians.
When you talk about accountability, what does accountability look like in the case of Arctic Frost?
Yeah, great question. So Arctic Frost was one of the biggest abuses of all time, so I think we should have some of the biggest accountability of all time. The operator level, I think, termination, reassignments, and all the like should be on the table. And to that end, the Oversight Project has been particularly vocal. We have called out people for having certain roles in it who have, to our pleasure, been either fired or moved about by Director Patel. So we're thankful for that. The real rub is it took a lot of people to pull this off, right? And so you're talking about institutional corruption. And so the accountability for institutional corruption is systemic reform. And I don't think that's necessarily underway. You can change the players and all those things, which is good, but you need to change the ability of institutions to be able to pull this off. And I think this reflects on a lot of our longstanding work and the work of the Heritage Foundation as to how to, reform the FBI, because we can't be in a position where, it's just patty cake and whack-a-mole and you get rid of a few bad apples. You need to really think about their ability to pull off weaponized activities here. And of course, I think a lot of this is illegal and should be met with prosecution when appropriate. We're talking about a massive civil rights abuse. I mean, it was political in nature. And that is a crime. It is a conspiracy against rights in many ways. And I hope, with the facts leaded, it can be prosecuted as such.
Talk a little bit more about the accountability that we've seen so far and what you would hope to see going forward.
Right. So Director Patel has gotten rid of quite more than a handful of people that were involved in this. And so that's all well and good. One of the chief engineers of the whole thing is a now disgraced former FBI agent named Tim Tebow, not the football player, the FBI agent. And he was really the quarterback of this. And we have been very vocal about him over the years. He's no longer with the Bureau, and that is a great thing. But many people who worked with him are. And so this is going to be something that takes time. And there are a lot of legal hurdles to jump through for government, personnel matters. And so, we are patiently waiting, to happen, but massive steps have already occurred. But it's far from over. That's what I remind everyone. Like, the road to reform is long. It took them decades to corrupt the FBI. It's going to take a long time to get it back on track.
The Oversight Project obviously is tracking Arctic frost really closely, but there's also a lot of other stuff on your guys' plates. Lots of really interesting things you're digging into. Give us a real quick overview. What are you excited about working on these days?
Yeah, so it's always got to be AutoPen number one. I mean, while Arctic frost is one of the biggest abuses of history, I'll take President Trump's word for it that the AutoPen scandal is the biggest one of the last century. And so we got to drive that baby towards accountability, right? Like, it's well established in the public's mind that Biden wasn't really running the government. I think our AutoPen investigation gave him symbol to that and a way to really think about how it worked operationally. And that's why I think it took off. Distilled the complicated to the simple. But there's a lot of things that can be solved as a result of that investigation. First, the commutations and the pardons themselves being invalid. There are people that are still in prison that could be released on a shortened sentence by virtue of the AutoPen, and we hope they're not. There are people who have been released in the Trump administration by virtue of Biden's AutoPen that should be back in jail. And so that's where we're pushing on. I think most of our energy is focused. Other things that are really hopping right now, I think Wikipedia is a fascinating topic. We've done a lot of work there exposing kind of the coordinated mob edits used to shape national policy and opinions. I happen to believe there's some foreign interference in that if the government looked into, they could figure out. And so I'm hoping that with the increased, hearings that are supposed to be happening and such, we can further that conversation because that impacts, the informational environment in a very big way with AI and everything. I'm laser focused on what I'll call Fedflix, not Netflix, but Fedflix. And so wait for us for some more news on that. And then we have an avalanche of stuff going out against, blue state governors that are really making a hobby out of what I think is across the line resistance, which isn't resistance, but it's venturing into the territory of illegality when you look at what they're doing, resisting ICE and obstructing ICE and so forth. And so that's where our time and energy is for the most part. A lot of good things coming down the pike.
All right, have a great day. We'll see you. Thank you to Mike Howell for his contribution to today's episode. You can learn more about Mike's work with the Oversight Project at itsyourgov.org. And you can stay on top of what he's working on by following him on X at @MHowellTweets or by checking out the Oversight Project's podcast, Swamp Justice. You can find links to both in our show notes. Thanks as always to you for listening to Heritage Explains. You can reach out to us with any thoughts, questions, or suggestions at heritageexplains@heritage.org. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Heritage Explains is written and produced by Mark Ghani, Lauren Evans, and John Pop.